He judged a man by his appearance, but it wasn't until the man's father arrived that the real shock came. What happens when a single moment of prejudice collides with the power of truth? Dive into this compelling story to see how one man's quick judgment leads to an unforgettable lesson in respect and humility. Delmonico's was the crown jewel of high-end dining, a place where reputation meant everything. Stephen, the restaurant's meticulous manager, prided himself on maintaining its exclusive atmosphere. One evening, a young black man named David walked in, requesting a table. Stephen, making a snap judgment, politely turned him away, claiming the restaurant was fully booked. But what Stephen didn't realize was that his decision, made in seconds, would soon unravel in ways he could never have imagined. Because David wasn't just any man. He was the son of one of the most powerful figures in the city. Delmonico's, one of the city's most prestigious restaurants, was the kind of place where the elite came to see and be seen. Its walls, adorned with elegant artwork, whispered tales of business deals and celebrations, while its mahogany tables gleamed under the dim glow of chandeliers. The restaurant's ambiance was a careful blend of opulence and exclusivity, a haven for those who lived comfortably above the hustle of the city. On a typical Friday night, the restaurant bustled with well-heeled patrons sipping expensive wine and savoring their lavish meals. The crisp uniforms of the waitstaff, the soft clink of silverware, and the muted conversations of the affluent created an atmosphere of quiet sophistication. Standing near the entrance, overseeing it all, was Stephen. As the restaurant's manager, Stephen had worked tirelessly to maintain the high standards Delmonico's was known for. He was a man in his mid-40s, tall, with neatly combed hair and an air of authority about him. His sharp suit was a testament to the importance he placed on appearance, both his own and that of the restaurant. Stephen had spent over a decade climbing the ranks, starting as a waiter and slowly earning his way into management. He prided himself on his ability to uphold the restaurant's pristine image, knowing that any misstep could jeopardize his hard-earned position. He scanned the room, his eyes flitting over the tables, checking for any signs of dissatisfaction or disorder. Everything seemed in place, just the way he liked it. But Stephen's gaze often returned to the entrance, where he stood like a gatekeeper, ensuring that only the right kind of people entered. Delmonico's catered to a specific clientele, wealthy, often white, businessmen, celebrities, and the occasional politician. Stephen believed that part of his job was to maintain the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere, even if it meant making quick judgments about who should or shouldn't be allowed to dine there. It wasn't something he thought about too deeply. It was just the way things were done. As Stephen observed the entrance, he noticed a young man approaching. The man was black, tall, and dressed in a sleek navy blue suit. His shoes were polished, and his movements were confident. But there was something about him that made Stephen instinctively tense. The young man entered the restaurant and smiled politely at Stephen. "Good evening," the man said. "I'd like a table for two, please." Stephen's initial reaction was to look around at the other patrons. The restaurant was far from full, but his mind raced with assumptions. He quickly surmised that the young man didn't belong. The thought crossed his mind. What would the other diners think if they saw someone like him here? Stephen forced a smile, masking his discomfort. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're fully booked for the evening." The young man's expression didn't change, though his eyes momentarily flickered with understanding. He glanced around the restaurant, noticing several empty tables. He could have pointed it out, but something in him said there was no point in arguing. He had been through this before. "I see," he said quietly, nodding slightly. "Thank you." With that, the man turned and walked out of the restaurant, his back straight, his head held high. He didn't make a scene, didn't show any anger, though the disappointment was evident in his eyes. Stephen watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of relief. He hadn't done anything wrong, he told himself. He was just doing his job, preserving the image of the restaurant, keeping things in order. That's what mattered. He couldn't afford to have anything disrupt the delicate balance of Delmonico's reputation. But as the young man walked away, there was a lingering unease in Stephen's mind, a gnawing feeling that he had made a mistake, though he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't the first time he had made such a decision, and it probably wouldn't be the last. As the manager, he was responsible for the restaurant's clientele, and certain guests, he believed, didn't fit in. The young man, David, walked away from Delmonico's with a familiar mix of emotions: frustration, disappointment, and resignation. He had learned a long time ago that people often judged him by the color of his skin before anything else. Even in places where he belonged, where he had earned his place through hard work and determination, he was often made to feel like an outsider. David was 33 years old, a successful attorney who had worked his way through some of the toughest law firms in the city. His father, Charles Simmons, was a self-made billionaire, and David had followed in his footsteps, becoming a man of discipline, intellect, and resilience. Despite his success, he had never escaped the reality of being judged first as a black man, and only later, if at all, as an accomplished individual. As he walked away from the restaurant, David pulled out his phone and sent a brief text to his father. "They didn't let me in. I'll meet you at home." David didn't feel like explaining the situation in detail over the phone. He knew his father would understand. Charles had always prepared him for moments like this, had taught him how to maintain his dignity in the face of discrimination. Still, it hurt. No matter how much success David achieved, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be places that didn't want him, simply because of who he was. Inside Delmonico's, Stephen continued to oversee the restaurant, oblivious to the storm that was about to come. As the minutes ticked by, he noticed a commotion near the entrance. One of the staff members hurried over to him looking anxious. "Stephen, there's a limousine outside," the waiter said, his voice tinged with nervous excitement, "and Charles Simmons just got out." Stephen's heart skipped a beat. Charles Simmons was one of the wealthiest men in the country, a titan of industry, and a frequent topic of conversation in elite circles. Simmons was not only a billionaire but a philanthropist and a man of considerable influence. If someone like Simmons was coming to Delmonico's, it could mean a major business deal or an opportunity for the restaurant to elevate its status even further. Stephen straightened his suit and rushed to the entrance. He needed to be ready to personally welcome someone of Simmons's stature. As he approached the door, he saw the man himself, Charles Simmons, stepping out of the limousine. The older man was in his late 60s, with silver hair and an imposing presence. He exuded authority with every step, and his reputation as a shrewd businessman preceded him. Behind him, another man emerged from the car, a man Stephen recognized instantly. It was the same young man he had just turned away. David stood beside his father, his face impassive but his presence undeniable. The contrast between the two men, father and son, was striking. Charles wore the mantle of wealth and power effortlessly, while David, though equally well-dressed, carried an air of quiet strength. A man used to navigating spaces where he wasn't always welcome. As they approached the door, Stephen's heart raced. He realized in an instant the gravity of his mistake. The man he had dismissed, the man he had assumed didn't belong, was none other than Charles Simmons's son. "Mr. Simmons," Stephen stammered as they approached, extending his hand in greeting. "It's an honor to have you here at Delmonico's. Please let me—" Charles raised a hand, cutting him off. His expression was calm, but there was a coldness in his eyes that made Stephen's stomach twist. "I'm here to meet my son," Charles said, his voice steady and measured. He should have already been seated. Stephen swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of Charles's words pressing down on him, each one carrying a silent accusation. His gaze flicked to David, who stood beside his father watching the exchange with quiet intensity. There must have been some sort of misunderstanding," Stephen stammered, desperately trying to find a way out of the situation. "I didn't realize—" "You didn't realize what?" Charles asked, his voice sharp. "That my son deserves the same respect as any other guest who walks through your doors?" Stephen's face flushed with embarrassment. His mind raced as he tried to find an excuse, some way to explain his actions. But there was no explanation that would suffice. He had made a judgment based on nothing but assumptions and prejudice, and now he was facing the consequences. David remained silent throughout the exchange, his face expressionless. He had seen this kind of situation play out many times before, but this was different. This time, it wasn't just about him. It was about his father and the principles he had been raised with. David had learned long ago to pick his battles, but he knew his father wouldn't let this one slide. Charles took a step closer to Stephen, his gaze unflinching. I've spent my life working to break down barriers, to create opportunities for people like my son to walk into any room with their heads held high. And here you are, a gatekeeper, turning him away because of the color of his skin. Stephen's throat tightened. He could feel the eyes of the staff and patrons on him, watching the scene unfold. His mind screamed at him to do something, say something, but he was paralyzed by the realization of his own prejudice, laid bare in front of one of the most powerful men in the country. Mr. Simmons, Stephen started, but Charles cut him off again, his voice as cold as steel. I'm not interested in your excuses, Charles said. You've made your decision clear, and now I'm making mine. Without another word, Charles turned to David, giving him a slight nod. David looked at Stephen one last time, offering a brief, tight-lipped smile, one that was more of a silent acknowledgement than a gesture of kindness. Then, together, father and son walked out of the restaurant, leaving Stephen standing there, his world crumbling around him. The restaurant had gone quiet. The whispers that followed were barely audible over the sound of Stephen's heart pounding in his chest. His hands trembled as he stood by the entrance watching the limousine pull away. In that moment, he realized the enormity of his mistake. He had turned away not just any guest, but the son of a man whose influence could make or break the reputation of Delmonico's. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and regret. Word of the incident spread quickly, and soon, whispers of what had happened reached the ears of the restaurant's owner, Mr. Cavendish. The fallout was swift and severe. Delmonico's, once a symbol of exclusivity and prestige, found itself under scrutiny, its reputation tarnished by a single moment of prejudice. A week later, Stephen received a letter. It was from Charles Simmons' company, officially terminating any future business dealings with the restaurant. The letter was brief but clear. The incident with David had been noted, and Simmons would no longer associate with an establishment that condoned such behavior. As Stephen sat alone in his office that evening, staring at the letter, he realized the true cost of his actions. It wasn't just about losing business or damaging the restaurant's reputation. It was about the realization that he had allowed his own prejudices to blind him, to make decisions that hurt not only others but also himself. For the first time in years, Stephen questioned everything he had built his career on, his beliefs, his judgments, his assumptions. He had spent his life maintaining the order he thought was necessary to keep Delmonico's running smoothly. But now, that very order had been shattered by his own hand. Stephen knew he would never forget the look in David's eyes as he left the restaurant. It was a look of quiet disappointment, a reminder that respect and dignity should never be contingent on race or status. It was a lesson Stephen had learned too late. As the evening drew to a close and the restaurant emptied out, Stephen sat alone in the silence, haunted by the choices he had made. And for the first time in his life, he wondered if he could ever truly change, or if he would remain a prisoner of his own prejudice forever. As Stephen sat in the quiet, empty restaurant, he couldn't help but wonder, how many other decisions had he made without truly thinking? How often had his assumptions guided his actions without him realizing the consequences? And now could he ever make amends for the damage caused by a single moment of prejudice? What do you think? Can people truly change after facing the consequences of their own biases? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more engaging content like this, make sure to subscribe and never miss a new post. Join our community of readers who love exploring stories with meaning, lessons, and real-life reflections.